Welcome to the Waking Up Podcast. This is Sam Harris. It's amazing, the pace of change. It's just impossible to keep up with current events. Today in the podcast, I'm bringing you a conversation with Sara Haider, who is the co-founder of the Ex-Muslims of North America. Many of you know Sara from Twitter. There have been many requests to get her on the podcast. Very happy to finally have her on, but we spoke after the Manchester bombing, but as it turns out, just before the London atrocity. And I suppose nothing really changes with each new event, but it is a very strange feeling to more or less expect some new eruption of jihadist insanity sometime soon. So it's just to say it's impossible to keep up with what's happening. But unfortunately, I fear this conversation will seem timely for the rest of our lives. Sara and I talk about what it means to leave Islam, about the unique issues that surround being an ex-Muslim as opposed to being an ex-Christian or an ex-Mormon or even an ex-Scientologist. And Sara shares this experience that very few people spend a lot of time thinking about, which is the experience of being an apostate, living in what would otherwise be the safest places on earth, in the safest period human beings have ever enjoyed, but nevertheless being imperiled by the sectarian hatreds of one community. There's a lot of talk about Islamophobia in the news. There's very little talk about the danger and difficulty of being an ex-Muslim in the West. That's why Sara's organization and her voice are so important. So, without further delay, I bring you Sara Haider. Enjoy. I am here with Sara Haider. Sara, thanks for coming on the podcast.
Thank you for having me.
I have been a fan of yours for, it has to be at least a year, 2 years. When did you give that talk at the secular conference?
It was at the American Humanist Association. It was in 2015.
I've started to realize that when I estimate the amount of time that has passed, I always should double it. So I said a year and then I went to 2 years because I knew I had to be wrong. This is what happens when you age. That talk was fantastic. And was that the first talk like that you had given, or had you been sort of on the circuit for a while and I just hadn't noticed?
I spoke here and there about my organization, Ex-Muslims of North America, and just apostasy issues. That was the first time, however, that I was really talking about the issues with liberals and Islam and how it kind of coincides in this very strange way.
Obviously, many people love that talk, and you have many fans among my listeners on this podcast, and many have requested that you get on. So I'm very happy to have you here. Speak for a moment about your background and just how you came to be one of the founders of Ex-Muslims of North America.
Sure. So I grew up in what I would consider to be a pretty liberal Muslim family. I didn't know at the time that my upbringing was so liberal relative to other Muslims. I only found out as I began to meet other ex-Muslims about what their reality was to know how good I had it. But I grew up in a relatively liberal Muslim family, which means that they allowed me to move away for college. They allowed me to sort of be a little bit more independent than Muslims generally are.
Where were you? Where were you growing up?
I grew up in Texas. I was born in Pakistan, and I moved here. I think I was 7 or 8 when we immigrated to the United States. I remember the process of coming here. I remember the shock of coming to this country. I actually remember the first time I saw a woman in public whose legs were exposed. It was a flight attendant when we stopped in Europe on our way to America, and I remember the shock. I remember feeling not really understanding what I was looking at, and not really understanding that this was going to be a norm in America.
Interesting. So you came from Pakistan when you said 8?
Yes.
And why did your family leave? Was there any, because it sounds like you had a family that was more liberal than most. Was that at all part of the reason why they left, or was it just a job change, or what was it?
Well, I think we would be called economic migrants, and I think it was just this general desire for a better life. However, my father does tell me that he specifically wanted a better life for his daughters. He had two daughters at the time, and he wanted us to have more opportunities, and he knew he would get that here.
So when did you realize that you were a bit of an outlier in terms of your family environment with respect to religion?
I started, well, I think most atheists would say this, and that's how I do identify as an atheist, that we were always sort of questioning. There were always sort of problems with religion, and I had them from an early age, but there was always ways for me to justify religious traditions that I may have found problematic. Until I got to be a little bit older, I was in my mid-teens when I really started looking at the religion in a really critical way. I started actually reading for myself the Quran and finding that there were problematic verses and things that didn't really make a lot of sense to me. And the more that I looked into it, the less that it made sense. And I actually encountered quite a few militant atheists, and this is why, even to this day, I don't think that militant atheism is such a horrible thing, because it does push people like me to look into their faith, if only for the reasons that that we want to defend it. And that is what happened to me. That I knew some atheists, and they were giving me some questions, some probing questions, and I wanted to be able to defend my faith. So that was one of the reasons that I looked into it with such urgency, because I wanted to be able to defend it, and I found that there really wasn't much there for me to defend. And so, I left the faith.
Were these ex-Muslims or were these Westerners?
Oh, these were Westerners. These were these were people who came from a Christian background and then left their faith, and then started uh, pointing out the problems within Islam to me. And of course, I was offended. So this is, something that people talk about a lot, that Muslims are offended when you talk about their faith in a critical way, and that's to be expected. And I was offended. I remember being offended, but that offense, it doesn't really mean anything. And in the in the longer arc of what we're talking about, which is truth. And of course, people will be offended if you talk about something that they hold so dear. But it did push me to look into religion.
Well, the offense is really a symptom of not having an argument. I don't get offended if someone claims that my deeply cherished mathematical beliefs or historical beliefs are false, because either they have an argument or they don't, and just offense never enters into it. The fact that we're in the territory where someone only has their offense to wield shows that there's a problem intellectually.
That's probably a part of it. At that time, when I was first being confronted with the problematic verse of the Quran, I didn't know it was possible. That seems ridiculous, and as I'm saying it, it sounds ridiculous. But I remember at that time not knowing.
You just didn't know what was in the Quran at that point when you first had these conversations.
Right. I didn't know exactly what was in it, and I didn't know that it was even possible to look at it in anything, but as this extremely virtuous text. I didn't know that there was an interpretation like that out there. So when I first encountered it, it was quite shocking to me.
So do you actually ascribe your becoming an atheist to these conversations? Can you point to the conversation that was a tipping point, or is the process more amorphous than that?
It was death by a thousand cuts. This was definitely the encounter of pushback by what I would consider militant atheists, was a part of it, and this is why I defend militant atheism at today, because I know that it had something to do with why I left. But it wasn't the only reason. There were 100 different reasons that the religion was making less and less sense for me, and I was starting to figure that out on my own. And pushback from people that were non-Muslims did influence me into looking at it in a deeper way, with more urgency than I would have otherwise. But I was finding that there were a lot of problems on my own. There were, historical problems. There were contradictions within the Quran itself. So there were a variety of issues with the faith.
So, what is the organization you founded, Ex-Muslims of North America? What do you guys do? And I mean, it's hard to imagine many people listening to this podcast would be confused about this, but still there must be some. But certainly, many people, even most people in our wider society, might not understand why there's a special need for an organization like this. What is so hard about being an ex-Muslim?
I think, well, like you said, it's not really well understood the extent to which there is Muslim conservatism and the way that Muslim communities in the West practice their faith and practice their traditions. Um, I know that at the time that I was sort of starting on getting involved in this sort of activism, that I thought that my experience with Islam was normal. I thought that I was a representative of a moderate Muslim. And then when I started to meet other ex-Muslims, I found that this was not the case at all. That I was extremely lucky with my experience with my parents, the fact that I had left the faith, and I hadn't been threatened by them, I hadn't been abused in any serious way, and I hadn't realized that I was kind of an outlier with that experience. And as I began to meet other ex-Muslims, I started to see that there was a huge need for people to just to meet others like themselves. And for me, it was kind of a curiosity, just wanting to meet other ex-Muslims. But I knew that for others, that was not the case. So myself and Mohammed Sayed, we were holding meetups for ex-Muslims very covertly. There was a lot of security protocols involved. But we were holding these just private gatherings of ex-Muslims, and we started to find that there were people coming from, I mean, it was outrageous. From 8 hours away, they would be coming 8 hours one way to attend, an hour and a half long meeting, just to be there and to experience the feeling of being with people that are like yourself, who don't demonize you for thinking the way that you do. And so when we started to see that, how big of a how major of a thing it was for other ex-Muslims, we knew that this was something that needed to be this needed to be a real thing. We needed to organize, we needed to create an organization around it, we needed to foster communities like the one that we had started to build in DC, all across the United States and Canada, and teach them what we had learned about community building, about security, about privacy. As I don't think, like you said, many Western, even atheists, wouldn't really understand the extent to which ex-Muslims are ostracized and even persecuted with their communities, within their communities, even in the West. To the extent to which that there's anyone who can relate to this, I find that people who come from Mormon backgrounds or just extreme Christian sects and Hasidic Jews can kind of understand where we're coming from, and can kind of understand the extremes to which their community can go to defend their faith. So I don't think this is something that is understood by the broader community of even atheists. And so XMNA exists so that we can form these communities. And I think the thing that we do that is most different than any other kind of atheist community is that we provide ways for them to be anonymous. All of our meets and our events are completely secret, and they're only available to people who are already part of the ex-Muslims of North America communities. And in order to join the community, you have to go through kind of a screening of sorts. That's what we call it. It's not a science; it's kind of an art. But we do the best we can to ensure that the people that are joining are those who understand the rules and regulations that we have, and also will keep the privacy and security of others in mind, and to screen as best as we can for people who may be malicious actors who are coming in for other reasons.
The emphasis on security issues is a sign of how different the situation is for Muslims. And I have a weird vantage point, or a unique vantage point on this, perhaps, because I see so much of what it is to become an atheist from all these different sources, being an ex-Mormon, an ex-Muslim, an ex-member of a cult, an ex-Scientologist. I see the exits. And what is unique about Islam is this implicit or very often explicit threat of violence. And so the security concerns that you're describing strike me as fairly unique
Right.
to Islam. And that's just still, again, it amazes me that this is an issue that people are unaware of or that obscurantists can successfully cover over when this gets debated in public. But it is a controversial point about which it seems to me there can be really no debate at this point. The laws around apostasy, the fact that leaving the faith is considered worthy of death, certainly if you speak against it, you can find that in the Old Testament too. You're not tending to see Jews or Christians, however extreme, even reference that edict. It's just there are theological reasons why that's the case, there are historical reasons, but I'm not hearing from ultra Orthodox Jews. I hear from them, and I hear just how difficult it is to be exiled from their community and to lose their marriages and lose their kids and all the rest. But I don't hear that they're worried that their members of their family will come and kill them. And I routinely hear that from ex-Muslims.
Right. So there's a pretty common thing I hear from ex-Muslims is when they're describing their family, they'll say, well, my parents are pretty liberal. I'm not worried about them killing me. And in any other context, that would be an outrageous thing to say, that they're pretty liberal, and in order to justify this feeling, you feel like they're not going to kill you. But that in itself, I think, should be telling that our organization needs to exist the way that it does. That we do need to follow all these bizarre uh, security and privacy protocols. We really shouldn't have to, but we do, and we do for a reason. And it's interesting to me that is, I find it to be ignored largely by the mainstream media, that this is something that ex-Muslims feel like they need to do, they need to hide. Many apostates are not open about their lack of faith. I know many ex-Muslims privately. I would say that myself and maybe Mohammed Sayed, the president of XMNA, I would say that between the two of us, we probably know more ex-Muslims than anybody else in the world. And I see sometimes, I'll see in the media various people that are participating in charities or in public service organizations, and they're represented as Muslims. This Muslim person is doing XYZ charitable endeavor, and it's very wonderful, and I will know privately that these are ex-Muslims, but they're not able to be open about their lack of faith because of the blowback that they will get in their community. So if for example, you're working on a charity, serving people in poor women in Pakistan, you're not going to be open about your lack of faith, because if you are open about your lack of faith, you're not going to be able to reach that community at all. You're not going to be able to have any contact with them. So in order for you to continue doing the work that you're doing, you're going to have to lie about your faith. So a lot of ex-Muslims do exactly this. And to the extent that we're talking about religious freedom, I know we talk quite a bit, in the mainstream media, especially liberal media, leftist media. There's a lot of conversation about civil liberties of ex-Muslims and religious freedoms, and we talk about them in context of certain traditions like the hijab. To the extent that the most fundamental freedom within the context of a belief system isn't guaranteed, that is to say, the freedom to leave, the freedom to not believe at all, to the extent that that isn't guaranteed, in my opinion, we can't have a conversation about freedom within that religion at all. Everything is to some extent coerced, because the most basic freedom, the freedom to leave, is never guaranteed.
And the security concerns are really pernicious because even if nothing ever happens, right, even if you never become a victim of any kind of violence, the plausible concern about violence is ever present and it adds friction to everything you do. Now, I encounter this in my personal life because of the issues I touch, but it has to be considerably worse for you and for anyone who's doing something similar. I'm very close to Ayan Hirsi Ali. I know what her life is like. I'm close to Majid Nawaz. He will, I'm sure we'll talk about what he's doing and how it may be different from what you're doing, but still anyone who's working in this space inherits this massive burden of worrying about what will happen when they become too visible. And it's as simple as not being able to hold a conference, right? Or not being able to have physical offices. If you're going to have an atheist conference, generic atheist conference, or a meetup for ex-Mormons, you never have to think that someone might want to show up and not only annihilate you, but to annihilate himself just for the pleasure of killing everyone in attendance. And this is an all too plausible concern given the world we're living in now. Is there anything more to say about how you handle the security issue that could be useful for ex-Muslims who may want to join your organization to hear, to put their mind at ease about how you handle this? Or is there any more to say about what it's like to be trying to get a movement off the ground under the burden of these kinds of unique concerns?
What I can say generally is that I don't think it's clear from the outside of the day-to-day struggle that this presents with us running an ex-Muslim organization. For example, we get nervous when we do simple things like go to the printer or go to the bank, and we have reason to be nervous. And there's a sort of paranoia that overshadows our basic day-to-day operations, and it presents a difficulty in that it's difficult to do our work enough as it is. And then on top of that, if you have to worry about being discriminated against or possibly being harmed in a severe kind of way by your banker, um, it makes the work that much harder to do. But from here on out, I'd rather not go into the details of how we protect us.
Yeah, yeah. You did an interview with Jeffrey Taylor, which was a great read, and you said one thing there that I wanted to read into this conversation. You said, if Muslims feel they're being badly treated here in the United States, they can go to Muslim-majority countries. But where can a person like me go? I'm in the safest place I can possibly be, and yet I'm too afraid to tell people where I live. It's tragic for me that there's even a need for our organization. And that really does expose just how unique a position it is to be an ex-Muslim. You are in the safest place in the world to be if you're a Muslim, even, really. I mean, we can talk about the problem of anti-Muslim bigotry, but I think it is safe to say that most Muslims are safer in the U.S. than they are in most Muslim-majority countries, given how unstable and sectarian those tend to be. But for an ex-Muslim in the U.S. or in really anywhere in the West, I guess it gets worse once you go to Western Europe, there is this real concern about not being protected by any community.
Right. And just to mirror your language, it's true that I believe it's true that most Muslims are safer in the West than they would be in a Muslim country. But more Muslims are safer in the US than are ex-Muslims. Ex-Muslims are less safe in the US. Ex-Muslims are less safe in Western countries than your average Muslim. And I think that's a perfectly fair thing to say, and it should be extremely concerning.
Yeah, and obviously you inherit all of the problems of, quote, Islamophobia, insofar as that is a problem. Having your name looking like someone who was born in Pakistan, you encounter the same bias or bigotry that any Muslim could be worried about going through an airport or in any other situation where that would become relevant. And yet you have this added concern, which I would argue is a far more pressing one, which is you have some percentage of the Muslim community that thinks what you're doing warrants a violent response. And you never know how big that percentage is or how much you're on their radar. And it bears repeating, this is unique to Islam. As badly behaved as Scientologists are when you take a good swing at that hornet's nest, they don't come and kill you. They can make your life miserable. They can sue you. They can show up at your office with a crazed look in their eyes and video cameras pointed at you 18 hours a day. these are bizarre people who are in an especially bizarre cult, but they don't commit murders and they don't commit suicidal acts of terrorism. And so this is, again, anyone who wants to defend Islam against the unique scrutiny that it merits at this moment has to deal with this fact that, as I said before, you have a play like the Book of Mormon that becomes a Broadway hit, and the Mormons take out an advertisement in playbill in reprisal, right? Their reaction is really adorable. There's not the slightest concern that Trey Parker and Matt Stone will spend the rest of their lives being hunted by religious maniacs. And yet, no one can even imagine staging such a play about Islam at this moment. And the reasons for that are patently obvious and yet everywhere denied by people who complain about, quote, Islamophobia.
Right. I mean, I think if Islam could get to where Mormonism is today, that we would be in a much better place. And I think that in itself should be telling of how bad things really are. And it's shocking to me that still we've been talking about this for a long time. You've been talking about this for a long time. Ayan Hirsi Ali has been talking about this for a long time. That we finally need to be honest about what's going on. And I don't see much progress in that direction.
Well, let's talk about the progress or lack thereof. So one sign of painful lack of progress of late for me has been the way that Linda Sarsour has been championed by liberals and feminists as some kind of icon of women's rights, when she, to my eye, is just a straight up theocrat and bully. How are liberals and feminists getting confused about this?
Well, I think the hijab is a good way to illustrate the extent to which liberals are confused about this issue, because as you pointed out, it's ridiculous to see the poster, the I think Shepard Fairey poster of a woman in a hijab as part of the Women's March. And I understand why people on the left, why progressives have this tendency. I understand what they are trying to do, which is to stand for the freedom of religion for Muslims. And this is a laudable endeavor. This is something that I support. This is a tendency that I really love about the left. I like that they instinctively want to protect the little guy. Having said that, not everything done in the name of good intentions is necessarily good, and not everything done in the name of good intentions will help the people that you want to help. And in many cases, it might harm the very principles or the very people that you want to help. And I think this is, especially the hijab in context of women's rights, is a case where we can see this in a very clear way. Um, and so I supported the Women's March. I supported, generally speaking. I'm women's rights are really close to my heart, and it's really important to me that feminism is something that becomes universal, that becomes global. So I support, generally speaking, these kinds of initiatives. But I was really disheartened to see that Linda Sarsour was included, and that the hijab was suddenly, it's become this totem. It's become this symbol of religious freedom, and it's pretty perverse. Um, it's pretty perverse, given the context of what the hijab actually is, and given the religious justification for the hijab, which is distinctly anti-freedom. It's very coercive. It's coercive in large parts of the world. It's coercive in Western communities today. And yes, Muslim women should have the right to wear the hijab. Yes, they should have the freedom to follow their religion as they see fit. But we shouldn't herald as some sort of symbol for women's rights as a whole, because that's not what it is. And the symbolism behind the hijab matters, and that's what's shocking to me, is that yes, we'll talk about the fact that Muslim women choose to wear it, and they should have a choice to wear it, and they should have a choice to be as religious as they want to be. But what does it mean to wear a hijab? why do Muslim women feel that they need to wear a hijab? You'll hear, I think it was Dahlia Mogahed that was on the Daily Show a couple of years, maybe just a year back. I'm not sure exactly when, but she was talking about the hijab and she referred to it as a means to, privatize her sexuality, which is a very interesting way to putting it. Particularly because, as I'm listening to it, I remember thinking, oh wow, that's clever. It's a clever way to phrase the hijab privatizing my sexuality, because that's something that she's phrased it in a way where it would be easy to accept by people who are from progressive circles, by educated people. She phrased it in a way that it would just, they would just swallow it whole and accept it. And I think they want to accept it. However, we need to go back to what the religious justification for it is, and what it implies. Even if we want to use her phrasing, let's look at it as a way of privatizing your sexuality. If you consider wearing the hijab, covering up as modesty, as a way of privatizing sexuality, you justify the viewpoint that women who don't do this are necessarily people who are publicizing their sexuality, and that if it means something, if you're signaling something by privatizing your sexuality, then you are also signaling something by publicizing it. And I think that needs to be discussed. That needs to be discussed widely. And it's shocking to me that Muslim narratives of what the hijab means are just accepted, wholesale. They're just accepted, and not a lot of criticism is given some honest consideration.
I think it's good to focus on the hijab because I think many people are confused about just what they should think about it. I think I'm pretty clear about the hijab. I'm a little confused, frankly, about the niqab and the burqa, I think. So it's just walk me through this. Here's what I think about the hijab. I think that, as you said, that the first thing to be honest about is that most women who wear the hijab the world over are not doing it voluntarily. And even if you could stand them up and ask them, and they would say, yes, they want to live this way, it can't be construed as a voluntary choice given the cultural context in which they're living, given the penalties for not wearing it, given how everyone in their life would think about them if they chose not to wear it. This is a choice against a background of almost total coercion. And then you have the rare case in the West of someone who, her sophomore year at Brandeis, can decide, well, maybe I want to wear the hijab, and it's a truly free choice. Now, I agree with you that any woman should be free to make that choice. They should just be honest about how different a choice that is than the pseudo choice that's being made every day by a woman or a girl in Saudi Arabia or any other theocracy. So people should be free to dress in that way, and we should also be honest that it's an ideological display, right? So when someone wears the hijab, they're telling me something about what they believe to be true, and there's no burden on me not to pay attention to that. I can notice that their external choice as an indicator of their internal worldview, right? And worldviews matter, right? What people believe and declare is important to them matters. So it's a conversation. You are starting a conversation with the world when you decide to put on a hijab. And one of the things you're saying, privatizing your sexuality is one way of putting it, but you seem to also be conceding, as is explicitly stated within the doctrine of Islam, that the onus is upon the woman to conceal herself as a way of protecting men from their lust. It's not that the onus is not on the men not to be boorish monsters who are just groping any woman in sight who's not sufficiently covered. The onus is on women to be sufficiently modest. Even if you're making a free choice in the West and Dahlia Mogahed is your guru, this is an anti-feminist concept of where the blame for social awkwardness and lust gets placed.
Every choice, even if there is a choice that is freely made by a woman, it doesn't necessarily make it a feminist choice. And in the context of the hijab, even if Dahlia or Linda Sarsour have freely made the choices that they've made. That doesn't make them feminist choices. They can be anti-feminist, they can be anti-women, they can be anti-women's rights. And that needs to be discussed and that needs to be talked about. To add on to what you were saying, well, when there's this burden of sexual purity that's placed on women, it's kind of a, it really is something that I would call a rape culture of sorts, where women that are subject to sexual assaults bear the blame if they are women who don't cover themselves in an Islamically prescribed way, and this is something that is pervasive in the Muslim world. The idea that a woman who shows her body, who is, even walks in a certain way or speaks in a certain way, they are to blame for male assaults against them. And you can see reflections of this in the ways that Muslim men treat non-Muslim women. I mean, I know there's the sexual assaults that happened in Germany on New Year's Eve. It wasn't something that was very surprising to me and to many people from the Muslim world. It's not entirely surprising because there is a dehumanization of women who don't cover themselves in the way that Islamic women are supposed to cover themselves. It seems to be a signal, a free pass to do with those women as you will, because they do not have the same kind of dignities that women who are covered up have.
So let's move on to even more aggressive covering. So the niqab, wherein only the eyes are exposed, and less people are familiar with that, I think, than the burqa, which is what you tend to see in Afghanistan, where everything is covered, and you just have this kind of mesh for the woman to see out of. There, I feel like my sympathies change a little bit because there's something so in the current climate, it's so provocative, but also, I think, unsafe and uncommunicative about covering the face. You don't know who anyone is. You don't get any of the social cues that are actually important for understanding whether you're safe around a person. The person who's having this imposed on them is being deprived of almost everything that's good in the world in terms of interacting with other human beings. What's your feeling about whether or not something like take the French approach to banning the niqab in public? How do you feel about that? Because again, following what we just said about the hijab, my bias is certainly to let people dress however they want, but there is something really terrible about covering the face in public, and I don't actually know what we should do about it.
Well, I agree. It's that it's unsettling in the way that just a head the face veil is unsettling in the way that a head covering is not. But I don't think that we should change our approach to it. I think anytime that a facial covering of any kind, a mask, be that be a party mask or a ski mask, wouldn't be allowed. Neither should a face veil, religious face covering, be allowed. But aside from that, yes, it is disturbing. Yes, it is. Yes, it does speak to this distance that Muslim women are sometimes, sometimes forced to to have with the world around them. But that doesn't mean that taking an action like banning it would be helpful. In my opinion, it isn't. I think what we do need to grapple with is that many Muslim women buy into the ideology that is given to them. Many don't, but many do. That's why you have Lundis Resors. That's why you have Dahlia Mogaheads. Is that there are women who buy it, and they actually believe that they are being empowered by Islamic traditions. And so there are women who willingly put it on, or think that they are willingly putting it on, and they feel empowered by it because they are fed a certain kind of worldview. And forcing them to take it off would not win us any favors from those women. And if anything, it might turn them into people that would want to wear the hijab, that would want to wear religious garb as a political protest. And increasingly, I see the hijab and just various kinds of religious garb as a form of political protest. And I don't think we should encourage it being turned into something like that, because it becomes more powerful in that way. And the harms that the religion itself perpetuates because of the hijab gets brushed to the side. So to follow up on what you said, which was that perhaps it would free the women that are truly coerced. Let's say a certain percentage of women are coerced to wear certain kind of religious garb in public. In the context of, for example, what the French were doing, I spoke out against I don't know the burkini, I think it was called, the Islamic swimwear that some French towns were trying to ban, and I spoke out against that ban.
That seemed like good sun shielding practices from my point of view. This is the other thing you brought up, is that there are other ways to cover your face that we can't make illegal. So if you're going to make Halloween masks and ski masks illegal because they're so similar to niqabs, if you have someone who's super sun sensitive who essentially is showing up in the equivalent of a burkini, you can't suddenly make that illegal. So it's a very weird thing to try to legislate.
Right, and you don't necessarily protect the women who are being coerced into wearing these things. For in the context of a burkini, so there are certain Muslim women who, let's assume, are coerced into wearing religious gear, and because able to wear a burkini, they have a little bit of freedom. They're allowed to go to the beach and they're allowed to experience, feel the sand on their feet and feel the water and get to participate in this public activity in a way that they probably would not be able to participate in if the burkini was banned. So, in the context of the most coerced women, I don't know if we're necessarily going to protect them because I don't know if the reaction of the most extreme religious families would be to say, well, if the state has banned a burkini, that means that you're allowed to wear a bikini or shorts or whatever it is to the beach. I fear that the reaction might be more often than that to say, well, you're not allowed to go to the beach. And maybe we're taking you back home.
It's a difficult one, and I don't know if legislation is too blunt a tool for this, but I can imagine, for instance, if I'm sitting on an airplane and somebody gets on with a ski mask or a Halloween mask and refuses to take it off, or I see someone passing through security at the airport with a ski mask or Halloween mask on, I would expect that person to be stopped and to not be able to fly unless they took it off. And then you could imagine that there's an obvious exception if they have a reason, if they have some medical reason why they have to wear a mask, or they have a burn on their face, or I mean, this is something that explains it. Well, then fine. But I think there are many public spaces where someone is in charge of legislating certain norms, even if there are not laws against these things. And yes, it's like you can't show up to a restaurant, without wearing pants, right? Probably there is some kind of law against it, but it's at the discretion of anyone who has control of a public space to deny access to people who are violating certain norms. And I think we just have to be honest about what it means to be wearing a niqab or a burqa at this moment in human history in the West, in an airport. You are advertising a worldview which is the worldview we care about from the point of view of being people who want to prevent suicide bombings on airplanes, to take the narrow case. So obviously you're going to draw more scrutiny. Obviously we can't see what's underneath this covering unless we put you in an X-ray scanner rather than a metal detector. It poses a security concern both physically and ideologically. I mean, you've announced your worldview in a way that you otherwise wouldn't if you weren't wearing this thing. It is analogous to, if we had problems with a cult of neo-Nazis that was killing people or threatening to kill people in virtually every city on Earth, it wouldn't matter if someone showed up at the airport with swastikas tattooed on his face or, proudly wearing, symbols of the SS on his jacket. I mean, this person is saying, pay attention to me. I'm a security problem, or at least a potential one. It never strikes me as trivial that someone is wearing a niqab, or that in particular, the man who is chaperoning her is the sort of man who wants his wife or sister to wear a niqab.
Right, but I don't know if it's I think we can make certain I think you're right to say that we can assume certain things. But I don't know if we can assume them universally. In the context specifically of a woman in a niqab, we can't assume that she's being coerced. We can't assume that she's not being coerced. We can't. We don't actually know where her true beliefs lie because of the specific context of this religion. And I don't know if it's helpful to make those assumptions.
I agree, you can't. But the balance has to swing one way or the other. And I think the French assumption that you'll be helping people. I mean, so I guess, I mean, the beach is an interesting case because I can easily see it going the way you fear, that these are women who just will not be let out of the house, given that there's no option for them to be fully covered at the beach. But when you think of something like a school, right, or a place of employment, it just feels like a ban on covering the face in those contexts. Again, it's like whether this is the law or whether it's just every place of business is free to have their own policy. I don't know, but it's just, I can't imagine hiring someone for some kind of public facing job where they insist on their right to wear a niqab, right? Like a bank teller, you're a bank teller and you're wearing a niqab, or you're a nurse in a hospital, but you're going to wear a niqab as you visit patients. I think you have to be free not to hire those people who insist that they wear a niqab in those contexts.
Well, I think in the to the extent that it gets in the way of your job duties, and you can make an argument that it would do that in the context of a nurse. I remember reading something about it's tangentially related, but I remember reading something about a female eye doctor in ISIS controlled territory who was no longer allowed to practice unless she had on a covering, and she complained that she wasn't able to see, and she needed to do these complex procedures with other people's eyes, women's eyes, and she wasn't able to see herself properly enough to be able to operate in the way that she needed to operate. So obviously, it gets in the way of job duties. Even you can make the argument. I think that there are certain social obligations, sort of social aspects of a job that require someone to show their face, but it's different that because they're different jobs would require that, and some jobs would require that and some jobs would not. And on the whole, I know that from a perspective of an activist, the more constraints we place on religious freedom, in Muslim religious freedom, the harder it gets for someone like me to argue in favor of Western values and for Enlightenment values. It's difficult for me to say that, in the West, they allow freedom. In the West, women can dress according to their conscience, whatever it may be, when there are clear examples of all these ways in which that is not at all the case. So while I don't want religions to be accommodated in any special way, I also wouldn't want them to be persecuted in any particular way.
Yeah, well, again, I'm just sort of thinking out loud, but I want to push on this intuition a little bit more because, if I'm hiring, let's take a job where it really doesn't matter. I'm hiring someone to be a remote assistant, right? I don't even have to see this person, right? This person's just going to be working for me, doing online tasks, and I don't have to see her, and she doesn't have to see anyone else on my behalf, but I have to interact with another human mind. And, it seems to me that I'm under no burden to hire a neo-Nazi for that job, right? And when someone says, well, listen, I really want to work for you, but I happen to be a neo-Nazi and I think that it would be a good thing if we just rounded up all the Jews and blacks and killed them, that's disqualifying. It's an idea that is disqualifying. But this person could argue, well, this actually doesn't prevent them from performing their duties perfectly. I mean, this is a job where I just need digital papers shuffled. They don't have to write articles for me and tell the world what I believe. So, would I be discriminating against a neo Nazi by not wanting to have anything to do with them in my life? Yeah, I would be, but I don't see a problem with that. I feel the same way about a sufficiently doctrinaire view of any religion, really, but especially Islam, given the connection to certain norms around violence. What percentage of people who are wearing a niqab or whose husbands want them to think that, infidels are fit only for the fires of hell and that apostates should be killed? I'm willing to bet it's a very high percentage. Maybe not everyone, but it's damn high. We're now in the territory of being able to really know what people think based on how they're dressing. And so I feel like, again, this, technically it would be illegal to not hire someone based on their religion, I guess. But it just seems like I feel like we need to be clear across the board. And again, it's hard to know how this gets realized in the public sphere, but I think we just need to be clear that certain ideas are so anathema to civil society that calling them religious and putting them under the rubric of religious freedom doesn't take the stink off of them. And it certainly doesn't remove the danger of having any significant number of people subscribe to these ideas.
My instinct would be to say that even if I knew that was to have someone has horrible views, so long as it doesn't get in way into their jobs, I don't see the great need to not. I mean, of course, I wouldn't want to necessarily work with that person, but I think the norm in society should not be to place any values on people's private beliefs, whatever they may be. And the reason I say this is because I don't know exactly where people would draw the line. I don't know. There are, for example, ex-Muslims who started to be. I know ex-Muslims who started to be a little bit more open about their lack of faith and started to speak out and have videos and start to do talks and later went back into the closet. And the reason that they did go back into the closet is because their employer found their views distasteful and they found them badly reflecting on the company. And of course, this is a norm in America, but in my opinion, it shouldn't be because people like him, as well as, I mean, neo Nazis aren't the only people who will be affected by this. It will be up to the employers as to what they consider distasteful or even what they consider controversial. And you will have private citizens who, in their private time, are participating however they are in whatever activism or ideology that they wish, who are then going to be coerced into being more silent.
Well, I guess this is just a place where our intuitions part company here. I think I have a more libertarian intuition about how we resolve these issues going forward. I mean, I certainly acknowledge that there is a time in the life of any society where you need to make it illegal to discriminate against people for various things. But I think there's a further point, and I certainly hope we've reached it, where if you're discriminating against the wrong people, you will just pay the price for that, right? So if you're a organization that won't hire any atheists, well then there will be a cost to that. You'll be reliably selecting against some of the most intelligent, well-educated people in our society. People will, if it becomes public knowledge that you do this, well then people will begin treating your business a certain way. People can boycott you. People can write nasty articles about you. I feel like at a certain point, laws against discrimination become too coarse a filter. And what we really want is to know what people think. And we want to know how they want to live. And when Chick-fil-A tells the world that they want gay marriage to be illegal, well, then the world can decide how it wants to respond. Now, unfortunately, and this cuts against what I just said, we live in a society where it seems that most people decided to line up and buy more of their sandwiches because they supported this principled theocratic stand. But I feel like on many of these questions, we have gotten over the hump. And if you are going to discriminate against gays or Jews or atheists or African Americans, or if that is the way you want to live, and I'm speaking now of, North America, there'll be a lot of pain meted out to you, which is best meted out by social attitudes running against you. But again, I think we're sort of in coin toss territory about whether our society is ready for that. It's a difficult problem because I just think I mean, I can't imagine being forced to hire someone who was a true Wahhabi style believer. How could that conceivably work?
Oh, and I agree. I agree that they are coarse. The discrimination laws and the categories of protected classes we have, they are coarse, and in there are certain aspects in which there's certain ways in which they don't work at all. And I'm again just going to throw ex-Muslims as an example. What if ex-Muslims of North America chooses not to hire Muslims, not just Wahhabi Muslim, but any Muslim, anybody who even identifies with the label Muslim, but we choose not to hire them. Um, I think that there are some people that would say that this is a form of discrimination because the law is coarse, but that doesn't mean I think that my intuition still says that it is necessary, because you can have a minority that is so small, is so small and so ignored that the broader social the social means we have of correcting such a problem are not going to be enough. And again, ex-Muslims can also be an example for this side of the debate as well, where our discrimination isn't something that is visible to the vast majority of Americans, and many people have a political interest in covering up the particular persecution that we face. And I remember the gay cake thing that was just on the news media. It was on every channel that I paid attention to, and it was because this was a big issue that there was a small, I think it was a mom and pop company that didn't want to make a gay cake because they disagreed with their religious prescriptions. But there are Muslims who will do the same to us, and there are far more of them than there are of us, and there's not many places that we can go. And to the extent that you have extremely small minorities who don't have much power, much of a voice on social media or any of these platforms to make their case known, they're going to get trampled.
This is brings me to another issue, which is really of a piece with the view I was just advocating a moment ago. How can we deal with the confusion about Islam and the obscurantism about it by Muslim apologists? How can we be honest about the unique problems in the Muslim community, problems of intolerance of free speech and women's rights, and the unique connection between specific doctrines within Islam and, global jihadism, without seeming to be pushing bigotry of any kind, or intolerance, or an alt-right political agenda?
Well, what's clear to me is that the answer to that is not what I would want it to be, which is that my initial understanding of active when I first got into activism, my thought was that all we needed to do was be more honest and just focus on facts and nothing else, and that would be enough to get people who are progressives to pay attention to this issue and to stop being obscurantists when it comes to this issue. But I haven't found that to be the case. The way that I approach it now is I talk about the harms of not being honest about the issue, about how much what we stand to lose when we conflate Islam and Muslims. And to the extent that I think that there are people on the left and they're progressives who are motivated by a desire to protect Muslims, they should be aware of what it is exactly that they're risking, of the harms on the other side that are likely to come about if we are not honest about this issue.
So, are you finding that you have? I'm imagining, I'm just kind of mapping Ayan's case onto yours. There are probably some differences there, but she is a famous ex-Muslim and has reaped a whirlwind of abuse because of that, and has found that her natural allies in the media and in think tanks and other institutions have been right wing, given the liberal confusion about just what you said, the difference between protecting a vulnerable minority and caring about political equality for people on the one hand, and speaking honestly about Islam as a set of doctrines. Are you finding that you have allies on the right disproportionately, or have you just at this point discovered that because you're an explicitly atheist group, they're not even allies? You're not Muslims who have converted to Christianity. You are atheists, which is, I would imagine, disproportionately a problem on the right. So how are you finding yourself treated by non-Muslims across the political spectrum, and how has the election of Trump affected things?
Well, I would agree with my case has been similar to Ayan's in the sense that I have found more of a welcome in right wing circles. To go back to the cake controversy, ex Muslims of North America we were having our third anniversary, and we requested that a large chain in our area bake a cake for us. And on it, we requested that there would be our logo and our name, ex Muslims of North America, and then the text, "Congratulations on 3 years." And the bakery refused to make the cake. And we had somebody from Freedom from Religion Foundation write a letter and send it to headquarters of that company. And in the end, the issue was resolved. But while the controversy was going on, the coverage was almost back to the idea that it is a Muslim practice, and the, the underlying problem that I have with hijab isn't just that that it displays itself in such a way, but that it is justified by the idea that women's bodies are a source of sin, and that women have a duty to cover their own bodies. And then there's this whole doctrine of modesty and of sexual purity. But there are many on the right, particularly on the religious right, that agree with some of those underlying principles, and they may not be as intense about it as as Muslims are, but they agree with that underlying principle because they do have, I mean, it's an Abrahamic faith, so they share some of those tendencies. And so, to the extent that I think that they're being honest that there is a particular issue with Islam that the Western civilization faces. But when we go down to the core of why there is an issue of why Islam poses a threat, I don't know if people on the right, particularly people who are on the religious right, will be honest about the issue.
So, how do you view this concept of Islamophobia? How do you deal with the word when it comes up? And again, how has Trump changed anything, if his ascendancy has at all?
Trump, I think, has made things difficult in a way that I find hard to articulate. I was afraid that he would win. I thought that he had a chance right from the beginning. I've been noticing, so some of the trends that you spoke of around the time when he was elected, that I thought many in the left were ignoring, and I predicted that he wouldn't be somebody who's good for this conversation. And I think that my prediction has been true. I haven't seen him make any motions that are moving us forward in this conversation other than to call it for what it is. But honesty, if we're going to have it, this is just partial honesty, and it's only step one. And just because somebody's able to name it doesn't mean that they're able to go anywhere else with it. And I think Donald Trump has shown many ways that he isn't able to go anywhere with it. I mean, he went to Saudi Arabia just last week, I think, and I don't recall him saying anything about the human rights abuses
No, no, he didn't.
in Saudi. I don't recall him saying anything at all. And I wouldn't have expected him to. I didn't, this to me it seems like there's too many people like him who are all too happy to use Islam and the threat of Islam as a cudgel against their left-wing opponents. But they're not actually caring about the roots of the issues, and they're not really being truthful when they say that they will address the very heart of it. I think Donald Trump has empowered people, apologists for Islam, because I think the left has taken this very reactionary stance, and it has to be called reactionary because that's exactly what it is. It's just a reaction to the power that they now see in the right wing, to defend Islam more fervently than they would have ever defended it before. And I've noticed that there are people who were somewhat on the edge, people who were familiar with the issues that ex Muslims faced, and they were willing to speak about it here and there, who are now feeling pressure to pick a side. And they have picked a side. And the side that they've picked is, let's not talk about it right now. Now is not the time to talk about it. So the election of Donald Trump, on the whole, I think has been just disastrous for this conversation.
Yeah, no, I noticed the same thing. It's a swing into identity politics as really the only remedy for Trump. You have to put as much distance between yourself and him and the alt-right, and the way Democrats and liberals are finding to do that is to just, again, grab Linda Sarsour's hijab tails and swing into oblivion. It's a real problem because it is making it harder to talk about this. But frankly, I was surprised at the line that Trump took with the Saudis because in the election, he was very clear on this point. I think he has at least 3 or 4 tweets. His record as an intellect is almost entirely a matter of what he has tweeted. But he had at least 3 or 4 tweets that are just, as uncompromising as you would want someone on the right wing to be about Saudi Arabia, talking about how women are treated and how they're a source of terrorism, and basically holding them to account for the spread of the Wahhabi worldview. And he went after Hillary for taking their money. But then when he got there, he only spoke negatively about Iran, as though Iran were the great engine of Sunni violence we see throughout the world. It was strange, and I don't quite know why it isn't perceived by his defenders as a loss of nerve. He talked a good game while running for the presidency, and then once he got to the Saudis, he literally kissed the ring and bowed his head. It seemed kind of pathetic. The only thing that he did, or really Melania did, which was new and commendable, was not wear a veil herself, as so many representatives of the U.S. government had in the past. And that was clearly a bit of progress. But I found that very strange.
I wasn't particularly surprised by it. I mean, he's been a hypocrite on a dozen issues and other issues in the past, and you can just people. It's become this ongoing joke that you use. You reference some of Donald's tweets that he sent out years ago, as a retort against what he's doing now. So I don't, to the extent that I think this man stands for anything, I don't have any hope in him, because I don't think he has any sort of principles, and I don't think his followers have many principles. And I think, I suspect that even if he was to change his stance on Islam, that I think that many of them, the people that are still with him after all this, the people that are still with him would follow him there as well. And I think that's something that's very frightening to me, where I see this happening on both sides of the debate, but particularly on the right, where there doesn't seem to be any kind of there's no sense of what it means to be a conservative, what conservative principles are anymore. It's just this ego, and you follow him wherever he goes. And I'm seeing that the two parties use the issue of Islam just as a political tool, just as a volley that they pass back and forth in order to score points against one another, and both of them move further and further away from any anything remotely resembling principles on this area. You talked to me. You mentioned Islamophobia and the problems that I have with this word are the same that you've mentioned, that you've articulated really well multiple times, and that many others have as well, which is that it conflates Islam and Muslims. I think it does something that is very dangerous, particularly for Muslims. That As we are becoming more aware of the specific problems in Islam, of the Islamic doctrine, and as terrorists and extremists around the world claim the banner of Islam and claim that they're speaking on behalf of all Muslims and this is what Islam truly is, so long as there's a conflation between Islam and Muslims, Muslims here are going to be, I think, in further trouble, in further danger of anti-Muslim bigotry if people are not able to distinguish between them and their faith. I was reading, I think it was a Brookings poll that showed that that Americans did make a distinction between Islam and Muslims, and what it found was that Americans had a more negative view of Islam than they did have of Muslims, which I think is a great tendency. You know, it shows that Americans are less willing to feel negatively about a group of people, and they feel more free to do it about an ideology. And what we need to do, is that we need to crystallize this distinction. We need to separate them as much as possible. And the reason is to protect Muslims from facing any kind of backlash that is taken in the name of their faith by others.
Well, I completely agree with that, obviously. It's just, if you can't make that basic distinction between people and ideas, ideas that can be subscribed to one or another degree by people, and people can change their attitudes with respect to those ideas overnight, you just can't even begin to have an honest or productive conversation about this issue. It's just, that is the one lever which you have to have in hand to start any kind of rational process going, and it's the one thing that Muslim obscurantists and apologists and, people who represent groups like CARE, the Council of American Islamic Relations, seem to want to obscure at any cost. I mean, it's just, that is the thing that they don't want you to understand about this situation, that Islam is a set of ideas, some of which are obviously pernicious and divisive in principle and that need to be criticized, and Muslims are just people, and they're not people necessarily who have any particular ethnic background, given that you can easily convert to or away from this set of doctrines. It's true that most people from certain Middle Eastern countries are Muslim, but the usual approach to identity politics doesn't really fit here, and people seem to be using identity politics in a very cynical way to advance what can only be called the interests of a kind of stealth theocracy.
Well, I think that what you mentioned, this conflation, this very cynical conflation, is in many ways it's dehumanizing to Muslims. You know, it paints them, as you said, as an inherently religious people, and like as if it's a feature in the way race is a feature, skin color or any kind of physical attribute, and it's not. It's not something that you're born into believing. It's something you're taught to believe. It's something that becomes a part of your life, but it is, you are able to shed it. And ex-Muslims are proof that this is something that is possible, even in the most extreme circumstances.
Yeah. Yeah. So let's talk about one extreme circumstance, which is becoming increasingly expected, even in the West. Let's talk about the recent Manchester bombing. We now have this pervasive threat of terrorism, and this is the latest instance. Now, in the aftermath of something like this, we hear the predictable things. We hear that the bomber was just evil, right? And the implication being that evil people will do evil things anyway. They don't need religion to do that. Or we will hear that they're insane, which is often assumed in this context. And again, that takes the onus off of Islam entirely. And then we have people saying things like, this person no more represented Islam than Anders Breivik represented Christianity, say. What do you do with that?
I think this falls in line with a broader problem with the way that we in the West look at Islam, which is that I think Western Christians and just Western religions as a whole have sort of moved away from the ideological, foundations of their faith. And there are many people who are born into those understandings, and they cannot put themselves in the shoes of somebody who is a true believer. So to the extent that it represents that terrorists are evil people, I think this is something that makes conversation so difficult, because I know for a fact that conservative Muslims and religious Muslims truly believe that what they're doing is good for the world, is good for their children. I mean, there's this idea that if a Muslim, if a Muslim father forces his daughter to cover up, beats her if he finds that she is dating somebody, secretly, there's this idea that he is a bad father, that he is a bad man. But from a religious context, he isn't. Not necessarily. This could be somebody who really wants what's best for their child, and who sincerely believes that if his female child was to lose her virginity, that she would be doomed into something that is doomed into an eternity of suffering. And of course, you don't want that as a father for your child. So even good people are, of course, pushed into doing what we would call evil things. So I think this is such a facile understanding of what religious conservatism looks like, and I think a lot of that applies to extremism as well. I don't think that it's fair to call them evil. Evil as even as evil in an abstract sense, because certainly they think they're doing a good for the world, and certainly from the way that that they understand the reality of the universe, they believe that they are doing something good. They believe that they are part of a grander arc that will bring the world to an image closer to what God desires. The more concerning thing, I think, for me, when we start to look at just extremism and then closely related, just fundamentalism or conservatism as something that is evil, we damn the vast majority of Muslims. So if we consider the idea that apostates should be killed, and anyone who holds it to be evil, if we think of the idea that homosexuals should be persecuted as something that is held only by evil people, then we are saying by extension that the vast majority of the Muslim world is filled with evil people.
What are your views on immigration now? And I guess in particular in Europe, given what we've been talking about.
It's difficult for me, I guess, to talk about what's happening in Europe, particularly because, as you know, it's not easy to get a clear understanding of exactly what it is, what is going on. There's just two exactly polar, opposite views of what's happening, of the effects that refugees and migrants are having on society, and it's hard to make sense of what's going on. And I think my general tendency, which is to land somewhere in the middle of those two polar opposites, is not going to be the more something that ends up being more accurate. As far as what it appears Sweden is doing, and Germany in particular are doing, with letting in just a vast majority of migrants, I think that the viewpoint that this is something that is going to play out in a pretty devastating way for Europe, that it may mean the loss of certain countries, in the sense that they will change so dramatically demographically that they are not, Germany will not be Germany as we know it today. I think that those fears are not unfounded, and I think that to let in so many people with no clear plan of how to integrate them, perhaps not even a desire to integrate them, is incredibly reckless. And it does a disservice even to the people that are coming in. I mean, they're the best thing that happened to me, and I mean, I'm an immigrant to the United States, but the best thing and I'm an economic immigrant, but the best thing that happened to me was not just that I live a slightly more comfortable lifestyle. It's that I was granted the freedom to live life the way that I wanted to live it. I was given protection from the state to be able to do that. That I was able to encounter ideas that changed my feelings on on my role as a woman, on my role in the universe. To me, that's the best thing that the West has to offer. But if these immigrants are going to go in and they're going to make a little Pakistan in Germany or a little Afghanistan, then the people within them, they're not going to experience these social freedoms and liberties that you would experience if you were a more immersed immigrant.
That's a great point. It's a really hard problem to talk about, and it's just getting harder because it would be hard to argue, probably impossible to argue, that the status quo is optimal, that what is happening now is exactly what everyone should want. Given the failures, the obvious failures of assimilation thus far, and given just the implications of the floodgates opening, it's hard to see that this is good for Europe and, as you point out, good for the people who are immigrating for entirely the right reasons. This has to be, at a minimum, thought through better than it has been. What's your view about the prospect of reforming Islam and creating a tradition of secularism along the lines that Majid Nawaz is attempting versus what you spend, it seems, most, if not all of your time emphasizing, which is undermining the religion itself and effectively spreading atheism, or at least providing a rationale for dropping religion entirely. How do you view the difference between those two projects, and do you think that only the latter is ultimately viable, or do you think there's a place for both?
To begin with, I support the efforts of reformist Muslims. I support Majid Nawaz. I think what he's doing is incredibly brave, and I think he's doing it for all the right reasons. And I support people like him who are pursuing the advancements of society using those means. But I disagree with the project altogether. I think it is not viable. I think it is not intellectually sustainable, and I think that needs to be that needs to be something that we need to grapple with. Like, for example, I think there is, from a reformist perspective, there is this idea that Muslims are just sitting there on some sort of continuum. You have liberal Muslims on one end and conservative Muslims on the other, and you can move conservative Muslims along that continuum one reinterpretation at a time. You can give them just enough reasons and groundings to allow them to just move along that continuum, and hopefully they'll end up being liberal Muslims. But I think this doesn't take into account the constraints of the faith itself, and many people have brought them up. So I don't think I need to go over that. That there's only a certain extent to which that we can really reinterpret the faith. Certain parts of the Quran have more room for interpretation. You can be a little bit more flexible with how you're wanting to look at it, and certain ones don't. And you're really tying yourself down to your ability to be able to do that, to be your ability to be able to tie yourself, into the shape of a pretzel in order to get to a liberal understanding. I think that's going to be very difficult. It's going to be hard to play out. And I think that model of a continuum where Muslims can just sort of abandon aspects of their faith, as if they were just mere traditions, just as if they were just cultural artifacts and something that they felt close to but weren't tied down to. I think that understanding is incorrect. I think for the vast majority of Muslims don't see it in that way. Don't see a continuum with liberal and conservatism. I think they approach their faith as a model for reality. I mean, they literally believe in what it's telling them, and they believe that it is more true than any other model for reality that we can possibly attain in this world. I was listening to just the other day. I was listening to a interview of Richard Dawkins by Mehdi Hassan, who's a British journalist. I think he's in America, but he's this intelligent guy. He's well spoken, very well spoken, good with the rhetoric, and he's able to articulate his beliefs in a way that where you can tell that he is more cosmopolitan than the average Muslim. And in that conversation with Richard Dawkins, uh, Mahdi confessed that he did believe in the miracles of Islam, which is that he did believe that Muhammad flew to heaven on a winged horse. That it was literally a truth. And if you have people who are so educated, so cosmopolitan, who believe that that is an actual reality, not some sort of metaphor, but that it happened, and they form their worldview around this. And what you're really encountering is not just it's not a continuum. It's just oppositional worldviews in the way that heliocentrism and geocentrism are oppositional worldviews. And in order to have if you're trying to have some parts of heliocentrism and some parts of geocentrism and hold them at the same time, that project is actually more difficult than it would be to abandon one and just ascribe to the other altogether. And I think that's similar to what I'm doing.
Well, having been around the block with Majid a few times, I think I know what he would say here, so I'm going to give my best version of Majid without the accent and without the fine clothes and see what you do with it. So I think he would make 2 points here. He would say that, one, you seem to be ignoring what has happened for the other great monotheisms, Christianity and Judaism, the way in which believers have, for the most part, in a way that has been unacknowledged, or at least need not be spelled out to their embarrassment, they have relaxed their hold on the more insidious, divisive, irrational doctrines and just kept the, quote, good parts. And so there you have Christians who take their Christianity very seriously, apparently, but don't waste a lot of time, or really any time, thinking about hell or thinking about the physics of resurrecting the dead or anything else that doesn't repay a lot of attention for a rational person in the year 2017. So why couldn't that also happen with respect to Islam? And if you think that's far-fetched to suggest that it would, how is it less far-fetched to say that 1.7 billion Muslims will apostatize and become atheists in any time frame that could be helpful to the future of our societies?
To answer that, I don't think all Muslims need to apostatize, and that's not what I'm aiming for. A certain amount of ex-Muslims exist as of now. We already know that there are ex-Muslims. A certain percentage of people in the Muslim world are already ex-Muslims, are already atheists who don't believe. I think if we were just to get to a position where those people were able to be more vocal about their lack of faith, it would be enough to just plant a seed of doubt with in Muslims as a whole, because I don't think the problem of extremism is due to conservatism as a whole. It's due to this idea that they are 100% sure of the truth of their faith, and all you would need to do is put in just enough doubt that it goes from 100% to 98 or even 99, and that might be enough that they don't hurt other people. And all of that goes back to that seed of doubt, I think, needs to be aimed from a secular perspective, and to say that it's to deny the very foundations of their faith altogether. And then to address the comment that, well, Christianity has gone through this and so has Judaism, I think this view doesn't consider sufficiently the differences that are should be clear with the Quran and the Bible. I mean, the Quran it's a literal word of God. It's God speaking to the public, and as far as I know, there is no equivalent to that in Christianity at all, with the exception of the Ten Commandments. The Ten Commandments are the only time where you have God speaking directly to people. The rest of the time, it's more of a game of telephone. So you have room to play around with the actual text in a way that you don't with the Quran. I don't think the Bible is an equivalent to Quran in that sense at all. It's an equivalent to the Hadith, the scriptures, the sayings of the Prophet that are outside of the Quran. The Quran is literal, it's perfect, and it's final. And because of these constraints, it's much more difficult to play textual games and try and finesse your way out of it. And then we also have to look at the fact that Christianity modernized in a different way. Christianity was not confronting modern science and a modern conception of human rights. Our ideas of where human rights should be, of where civil liberties should be, developed uh, bit by bit. And Christianity and Judaism had a chance to move along bit by bit so that their followers were never completely aware of the extent to which that they were abandoning their religion, because in their view, in their lifetimes, they weren't abandoning it so far. But when we can look at it from uh, the view of hundreds of years, and we can see how far that they've walked away from their religion. But any individual Christian wasn't aware of how far that they were going when they were making one little concession here, one concession there. Islam, on the other hand, is a medieval faith, and it's confronting modern day understandings of science, modern day understandings of civil liberties and human rights. And you can't. I think it's much more difficult to imagine that you're going to bridge that gulf and you're going to do it in one big leap rather than shatter the idea of the faith altogether.
That is a fascinating point that I don't think I've heard expressed. I think that's really interesting to reflect on, just the difference between the confrontation between Islam and modernity and the gradual erosion that Christianity and Judaism confronted over centuries. It does have much more of a zero sum implication to it, and I think it inspires the kind of backlash that we see, which is people swinging further into their identities because to give up anything is to give up everything. I do take all those points about the unique status of the Quran and the specific doctrines around that. There is much less room to bend and many more occasions to break in Islam than in Christianity and Judaism, and that's certainly not helping matters at this point. Finally, Sarah, I just have one more question, and it's a personal one. Have I ever said anything about Islam or any of these related issues that you strongly disagree with? I suspect you're fairly familiar with what I've said and written on this topic. Is there any place where you think I've gone astray or aligned myself with a view that you find objectionable? I mean, where have I disappointed you, if ever?
Oh, that's a tough question. At the top of my head, I know that it seems like just from this conversation now, I think it's become clear that we do disagree a little bit on the extent to which we should police undesirable opinions. But outside of that, I can't think of anything that I specifically disagree with. Generally speaking, I have a more civil libertarian view on how we should confront this faith, which is to say that it really needs to be argument central and centric, and we need to ensure that we grant and guarantee Muslims their civil liberties as much as we can, because I think that's absolutely fundamental to this conversation moving forward. Um, I want Muslims to feel safe in America. I want them to feel that they have a right to their opinion, and that will not affect their status in this country. That will not harm their rights in any way, because I think that moves the conversation forward. There was a Australian imam, I think Hibs Tahrir imam, that who was talking about it was in the headlines. I think it was just Daily Mail possibly. it doesn't exist out in the open, someone like me can't point to it and say, look, this is reality. There are many Muslims who think that apostates should be killed. I have a harder time advocating for the protection of ex-Muslims. I have a harder time convincing fellow liberals that this is how bad it actually is in Islam, unless unless these ideas are voiced in a public forum. And one of the ways that Muslims will feel free to do that is if they know that even if they have despicable views, their civil liberties are guaranteed.
Yeah, well, I certainly don't disagree with that as stated. It just comes down to what we mean by policing, bad opinions. I mean, for me, it really is largely, if not entirely, a matter of shining light on them. But you do have these corner cases where you have people being forced to support people and even the livelihoods of people who want them killed, right? So you have an imam. I guess this doesn't happen in the U.S. in quite the same way. Mosques are tax exempt. That's a kind of support. But in places like the UK, you've got people on the dole, right? Who people who've moved to the UK and have whatever immigration status they have, but they're being supported by government funds, and they're preaching the death to infidels from the pulpit and spreading those views. It doesn't seem crazy for the British to rethink that arrangement.
I mean, I don't think it's crazy, and I don't even think that it's bigoted necessarily. It makes I sympathize with Europeans who are concerned about the welfare of their children and who don't quite understand what it is that they're facing. And when you don't understand it, you're going to fall in line with anybody who's able to give you a solution at all. So I sympathize with that view, and I think that the ways in which that people who are concerned about this and want to address this issue are demonized is extremely unhelpful. Having said that, even though it is an understandable view, this is one of those uncomfortable things that we just have to get used to, and we just have to accept if we're going to be part of a free society. There shouldn't be accommodations made for Islam, and there are in many ways, I think. But there also shouldn't be any sort of special persecution of any kind.
Again, it's just most of the interesting cases are in these gray areas. So,
And it's not going to make us comfortable to choose it. I mean, I understand that it. I understand how uncomfortable this is for me to say. Believe me, I don't. I don't like it either. That this person is. There are. I know that there are imams even in the United States who hold extremist views. They may be sharing extremist views, and they may be supported by my tax payments to the government. And that's that it makes me uncomfortable, but it is a price that I pay for living in a free society. And I think that, yes, it seems like this is a way we can tackle an issue, but I think that it's the wrong way to go.
well, just to be clear, because I do want to get at our difference of opinion here, if in fact there is one, but I'm not sure there is. So, for instance, I am a free speech fundamentalist. I think you should be able to say anything, and there should be no law against saying it. I guess short of actually, suborning the murder of somebody and becoming a part of a stream of causes that would get someone killed. But you should be able to be a neo-Nazi and have a podcast and talk about your neo-Nazism, and you should be free to be a jihadist and talk about those views without sanction, except for the sanction of everyone noticing and finding you to be a contemptible person as a result. So the reputational disadvantage of having dangerous and idiotic views should be there to be exploited. And then when you come down to things like hiring, like, so for instance, I don't see how you could hire a self-described jihadist, right? Or a true conservative Wahhabi or a Salafi Muslim. How could you? It would be a security threat to you to do so, right? It just you couldn't actually do it. And to force you to do it or to call you a bigot for not doing it would be insane. Do you disagree with that?
No, I agree with that, and that's why I brought up that issue as something that presents a problem with that, with the viewpoint that I just shared earlier. That we have thought about this. We have looked at, discrimination laws and how they might apply to ex-Muslims in North America, and how we run, and could we, could we be prosecuted, and how we should word our language, and how we should, consider this moving forward, because it may be an issue. And I don't exactly have a solution when it comes to hiring and security.
But actually, even security, I mean, security makes it crystal clear, but a Christian fundamentalist megachurch, take, Rick Warren's Saddleback Church, if I apply for a job there and they decline the pleasure of my company, I shouldn't be able to sue them for religious discrimination. They would be right to worry that my presence there wasn't aligned with their goals as an institution. Again, now we're just in the territory of ignorance here, because I think maybe there is some kind of loophole for religious institutions to only hire people who share their faith. I don't know, but it's clear to me that there's no security issue here, but why on earth would they want me representing their institution?
As far as I know, and I think this is speaking, that I am also speaking from a fair bit of ignorance here. I think religious schools, for example, can choose to, clergy, the people, you can, if you work for a church, you can choose to hire people who believe in the Christian faith. I think there's some precedent for that. What might be clarifying in this, for this particular example, is if the people that you're hiring believe in something that directly contradicts with the mission of your organization. And some organizations are mission based, and some organizations are not mission based. And to the extent that if you're a telecom, company, you don't have a mission that feels one way or another about religious conservatism. But if you are an atheist organization, you do, and your mission aligns closely with that, with that ideology. So if someone were to present the opposing viewpoint, I think there might be some wiggle room there, and there might be some justification to say that this person presents a problem that would interfere with our operations in a way that would not if it was just a general company.
Yeah, well, these cases are, I think, going to become more and more relevant going forward, because it's just, this issue isn't going away, and clearly we have not found a way to talk about it that is satisfyingly rational and productive and leading to political outcomes that most of us want. It's the Wild West out there, and you speak three intelligible sentences on this topic, and you're either called a racist or some other distracting thing happens. So it's really a pleasure to have you as a resource, Sara, to talk about these things, because as is now perfectly clear to our listeners, you have a very unique job, and you need much more help than you've gotten thus far to do it. And so I would just encourage everyone who's listening to support your organization, and follow you on Twitter, and pay attention to what you're doing going forward. To close out here, please give whatever relevant details you want for how to find you online. What is the website and the Twitter handle?
Right. So our website, the ex-Muslims of North America website, is www.exm as in mangoes, n as in Nancy, a as in apple.org. And my Twitter handle is at Sara the Haider. And I would encourage everyone to, follow us on social media. We are planning on launching a student tour that we're really excited about. We really want ex-Muslims to be represented in this conversation. We have skin in the game, and we deserve, I think some consideration. So we're going to be doing that very soon, and I encourage people to sign up so that they can hear about when we go, and where we're going to be going, and when. And just to close out, I do want to, thank you, Sam. Thank you so much for speaking about this issue honestly and clearly. And I know what a minefield this is, and I know the personal cost that people like you especially pay, people who are not from, a Muslim background at all, pay when you speak about this issue. And I think it's, this is the only way forward. And if people can take some sort of if they can follow your lead, I think we will all be a little bit better off.
Well, really, it's a pleasure to know you, Sarah, and keep it up. I will keep supporting you loudly and quietly as I can.
Thank you, Sam.
If you're enjoying the Waking Up podcast, there are many ways you can support it. You can leave reviews on iTunes or wherever you happen to listen to it. Better still, you can tell your friends about it or share it on social media. And if you really want to make sure this project endures, you can support the show directly through my website at samharris.org/support. As a supporter of the podcast, you'll get early access to tickets to my live events, and you'll get exclusive access to my Ask Me Anything episodes, as well as to the AMA page on my website where you can pose questions and vote on the questions of others. And please know that your support is greatly appreciated. It's listeners like you that make the show possible.